Thank you for joining us. My name is Mia Burke, and I work as Program Manager for Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit based in Seattle that advocates for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And the most important thing we do, and something that makes us unique, is our support of workers on the front lines of cleanup. This is the 25th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. If you're new to the series, we started it to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup by inviting speakers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Joanna and Tim Smolko. Joanna is a musicologist and earned her PhD in musicology from the University of Pittsburgh. She currently teaches various music courses through the University System of Georgia, as well as works as a private music teacher and academic editor and coach. Tim is an academic librarian and musicologist. He earned a master's in library science from the University of Pittsburgh and a master of arts in musicology from the University of Georgia, where he currently catalogs original monographs. Joanna and Tim co-authored the book Atomic Tunes, The Cold War in American and British Popular Music, which they will be talking to you about today. Just as a heads up, the presentation will be about 45 minutes long, and we will leave time after the presentation for Q&A. If you can't stick around for the whole time, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and will share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joanna and Tim. I'll pass it to you to talk about your work.
All right, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm really excited to give this talk. The women I'm talking about today, I find very inspiring, a real light in times when, it can be hard to see if your work is making a difference at certain points. So I'm going to start because I don't know everyone, and I'm not sure what your familiarity is, but this is the talk later didn't read version of the Cold War, and then I'll explore a little bit more. So we're talking about the Cold War, we're talking about after World War II, although we know that the atomic technology was happening, especially during World War II, and we're capping it off in the 1990s. Especially with the fall of the USSR. We when we're talking about the Cold War, we're talking about nuclear weapons, we're talking about these technologies, we're talking about the reception and the use of these technologies, and especially we're talking about proxy wars or smaller wars that were almost like moving people on a chessboard because the fear of conflict, especially between the US and the USSR with their fully armed nuclear arsenals, it was very terrifying. So a lot of times other countries were pulled into the conflict. Around this, we have responses on both sides of art, music, literature, and film that is either trying to support or expose or protest elements of these the different sides in the war. 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, was a capstone moment. We're not going to talk a lot about that, but a number of the songs in our book are address the fall of the Berlin Wall, or were used, or we even have a case of Bruce Springsteen singing in East Berlin before the fall. So there's a lot of interesting song elements. But let's dig a little deeper into this period. So we have the atomic age. This is a time where weapons are actively being developed. There's a lot of fear. You have things like duck and cover drills in schools. A lot of espionage is happening. Then we move into detente, which is a time of almost cooling off, which is a funny thing to talk about in the Cold War, but it was a little bit backing off. People were becoming more aware of the dangers of these weapons. There are a lot of protests that are happening at this time, exposing some of the difficulties of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials. We get in the 1980s, we have in the songs, we see a lot of personalization of the elements of the war. We see people talking about people they meet. There's songs that are comparing what it is to live as a normal person on either side of the war. It goes hands in hands with social history, which seeks to look at what ordinary people are experiencing during events rather than just the top leaders and those making military decisions. Okay, so nuclear arms race, build more and more and more and more, goes along with a space race. We're trying to, where people are showing their superiority in building these machines and rockets, and it keeps going up and up and up, and the stakes get raised. I mean, we already mentioned proxy wars. But we also have this ideological battle between capitalism and communism. And this addresses US and Soviet relations. One thing that we found has been under-addressed is that some of the people who were really pushing against fascism in the US, who would oftentimes be labeled liberals or commies or sympathizers, were veterans of World War II. And so they saw the dangers of fascism as having equal or greater weight than the dangers of communism. But their voices were undermentioned and underheard. But I think keeping in mind that many of these were veterans and had actually seen the cost of fascism, it's really important to keep that balance in our narrative. All right, other elements: space race, espionage, Berlin Wall, McCarthyism. This is a time of great fear where reading a book or playing guitar, calling your musical get together a hootenanny, could get you labeled as a communist, possibly with strong consequences, including blacklisting. This is a time of civil defense where people are encouraged to build their own fallout shelters. This actually brings out some of the rifts in the US, as many times in the cities, fallout shelters were not built in the Black communities, and in cities, it also you wouldn't be able to build your own. So there's definitely, we talk about redlining, this falls into that. This is a time of glasnost and perestroika, with the coming in of Gorbachev, especially in the 80s to 1991, when we have the fall. This is a time when it's almost like pre-democracy, when the Russian government is working towards more openness, both in the government and personal freedom, as well as cultural expression. So the 1980s is a time when people like Billy Joel get to travel throughout Russia performing concerts, which was unheard of years before. And of course, our focus in our book is on cultural responses, especially music, but there's a lot of overlap between art and literature as well. Briefly going over world leaders, we have Harry Truman, who orders the nuclear bombings on Japan. So this is really the entrance into this Cold War period. And he also okays developing the hydrogen bomb, which, if you saw Oppenheimer, this is a very controversial move, even by those who are working on nuclear technologies. Following that, we have Dwight D. Eisenhower. He builds up nuclear weapons, and from there we have JFK, and we all know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we're going to talk more about a very important decision he made during his presidency. Of course, Lyndon Johnson is associated with the beginning of the Vietnam War. And he decides not to run for a second term because of how unpopular and unwieldy that war was. The war continues under Nixon. And then we have Ronald Reagan, who's a very complex figure um, in this time. He's at the beginning, during his first term, he continues the process of building up weapons, but by his second term, he works with Gorbachev to help end the Cold War. Other world leaders, of course, in the Soviet Union, we have Stalin, who spreads communism and is also very oppressive in his stance towards Eastern European countries. We have Nikita Khrushchev, who eases up on the brutality, but still tries to spread communism. And he actually gives a nuclear war weapons to Cuba. Following him, we have Brezhnev, who's only rules for short years, and then Gorbachev, who we found has been in the West has been underrated in how much he did to help open up Russia to the world and to allow more freedom and move towards democracy. However, it was a fairly abrupt shift, and this caused some chaos, which eventually led, of course, to people like Putin coming into the vacuum of power. We also have Mao Zedong, who improves China's standing in the world, but also his policies led to mass starvation in his country. Okay, so those are some of the major big name players. Now, why our book? Why are we talking about songs in the light of all of this political turmoil? If anyone has forgotten, I don't think they have with the recent news. We still have lots of nuclear weapons around. We keep hoping our book will become less relevant. And that has not been the case. We started in 2013 when things were a lot calmer, and it did not stay that way. So there's about 13,000 nuclear weapons still in existence. We have about 6,000. The Russians have about 6,000. So we still have that balance. I hesitate to call it balance, but China, England, France, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea also have nuclear weapons. Okay, we found this started when Tim was listening to the radio and heard 3 songs in a row about the Cold War and realized that though there have been many books written about rock and roll in Vietnam era, for example, or even classical music in the Cold War, there was nothing that took an encyclopedic view of songs about the Cold War itself outside of Vietnam. We did include some of the songs about Vietnam, but because these have been covered elsewhere, we were trying to look at songs that conveyed other issues. Why were people writing these songs? Some songs were directly written as protest or sometimes celebration. Some were written as entertainment. We found a theme in the 1950s as bomb shelters as makeout pads. So they were trying to throw some humor into the mix. And in fact, we have a whole chapter about comedy songs. Some are really tasteless, and they reflect some of the prejudices and racism of their time. Others are still beautiful and still extremely relevant, unfortunately. So, why are we looking at these songs? These songs become, we call them cultural artifacts of the time period, and they show several things. They show what information people had available. We found that when a lot of the information was suppressed, that the songs were a little more light or cheerful. Most of the time, there's still standouts like Pete Seeger, who kept bringing attention to nuclear warfare throughout his life. Um, but when we start to have more information about the risk and the damage, more songs are sung that are in a darker tone. With the viewpoints, we found that there's two planes that kind of define where a song might lay on their viewpoint. The first is the timeline. So again, what part of the Cold War are we in? And the second is the genre. So things like country songs tend to take a very different viewpoint than something written by a heavy metal performer or a folk musician or a punk rocker. So somewhere between time period and genre, we have the different viewpoints that emerge. Um, we have so many people, people you've never heard of, but people from Rolling Stones and Elton John, ABBA, John Denver, Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, Joan Baez, who we're going to talk about today, who are all singing songs about different aspects of the war. What viewpoints are we seeing specifically? We have songs about nuclear warfare. We have songs about nuclear energy. We have songs about the fears that people had about World War III. We have songs about civil rights, women's rights, human rights. Almost every topic you could imagine, from the physical consequences to philosophical meditations to extremely dark humor, are found in these songs. And then some of them are appalling. Some of them will mix religious metaphors with atomic metaphors and come out with things like Jesus is going to hit us like an atom bomb. And it's just really, really disturbing imagery. Okay. Musical styles. Goodness. We have everything from rock and roll, blues, folk songs, country songs, westerns, gospel music, punk songs, heavy metal, and almost anything in between. There were songs written in most of the popular music genres from the 50s through the 90s. Okay, now let's dig a little deeper. Why particular music? And when I'm teaching, I try to get my students to kind of pull this out when we're talking about music of advocacy or music of protest. Why music over a lecture? I say ironically as I give a lecture. And some of the things we come up with is the embodiment of the issue. It becomes personal when it's sung about, whether you're hearing it sung or whether you are participating in the singing. It also puts emotion around complex ideas. This is a neutral. Propaganda can flourish with music because it can pull at your heartstrings, but emotion can also be something that personally connects you to a story. Community building. When you sing together, your breathing links up with your neighbors, and apparently even down to your heartbeat starts to link up with your neighbors. So singing together about a common cause is something that will actually tangibly build community. Coordination. When you are working at a protest event or a march, say something like the March on Washington, for jobs and freedom in 1963, you have to coordinate a lot of people through space. So singing and the rhythms that help line up heartbeats also line up the way that we walk or march or move. And then finally, storytelling. A lot of these songs tell stories, and the very act of narrative pulls people in and personalizes these big events that are hard to conceive on such a grand, big level. If you can take it down to a story, you can hear, you can understand, and you can respond. So with these songs, I've found that there are three spectrums that exist. The first is on perspective, and we ask, does this song advocate for something good, or does it protest something that shouldn't be? And most of the songs will fall somewhere on the spectrum. So some of them are very directly, hey, let's do good in this world. Let's gather together and do this good thing. But others are about exposing. Um, Here's this bad thing you might not have known about, or you might have dismissed or overlooked. By writing a song around it, we can preserve that moment, and bring your um, bring your place to the table. You can participate in relieving that evil or that issue. There's also the range of narrative from topical songs to universal themes. Topical songs oftentimes act like a newspaper. They will give you a short clipping of an event, something like um, Bob Dylan's Ballad of Medgar Evers, talking about his death and assassination. Is giving very specific historical information as well as giving emotion to the narrative. Universal themes can oftentimes apply to any point in time. What side are you on, for example? You can ask, what side are you on, for many, many different sides. And so it ends up being a song that's recycled over and over again in political events. We also have the range of emotions. This can be anything from grief or invitation, come alongside us, come work for a cause, or it can be rage and accusation. And again, I want to say these are neutral. There's sometimes that call for the rage and accusation side of it, something like Masters of War, where Bob Dylan looks at people who are orchestrating a war with no skin in the game. They're moving people around like people on a chessboard. But sometimes we need to invite people. Like we can say we have different perspectives, but here is something we can both come together on, and move forward with. So also, like, the songs have different purposes. And along that spectrum, we also have the humor songs. Like sometimes we have to have those sparks of joy or even laughter. I would say, especially when we're in a hard situation. All right, so that brings us to why women. Um, and what I found is that the women's songs have a very broad set of topics within them. Some of the songs written by male songwriters, and this is not all of them, but some of them are focused on us versus them. How do we fight off the bad guys, for example? Where I've found with the songs written by women, there tends to be or tended to be a lot more personalization of the narratives. I've found that in addition to being opposed to war, a lot of them will focus on, okay, what is this doing to our environment? What is this doing to our families? How is this affecting our children? Which brings us into a big issue that happened in the US, where we began to test nuclear bombs on our own soil. And this happened in Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. They oftentimes would do it in areas that were sparsely populated, but the wind would pick up the radiation and would pull it over other towns. And so what happens is that the wind brings over the radiation, the rain pulls it down to the ground, the grass grows in the ground, the cows eat the grass, the women and mothers drink the milk. And they found that radiation, particularly the chemical strontium 90, was being found in babies' teeth. How did they find this? Many women sent in their children's baby teeth to be tested, um, to prove that this was something going on. And I want to show you a quick, here we go. Cold War cache of 100,000 baby teeth. These are still being studied. These still exist. And 100,000 teeth is a lot of teeth. I just wanted to show you that because it's, still making the news. So these women organized, and they started a movement called Women Strike for Peace. And they had 6 objectives: walk, vote, talk, work, act, write. And I want to add to that music, because music became a huge part of this movement. So, how did this come together? Let me go back to my slideshow mode. We have a lawyer and politician and human rights activist named Bella Abzug, who gets together with a children's book artist, Dagmar Wilson. Dagmar Wilson was something of a socialite, and she was very disturbed by what she was hearing coming out of the West. And her husband actually encouraged her. He said, "You have many connections. Why don't you help to organize?" So she got together with Bella Abzug, and they started an enormous letter writing campaign. As part of this campaign, they wrote to President Kennedy, and they wrote to the premier of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, but they also wrote to Jackie Kennedy, and they also wrote to Nina Khrushchev and said, "Hey, this is what your husbands are doing. Make it stop." Following up with the letter writing campaign, there was a multi-city protest and strike in 1961. And this was the largest women's peace protest of the 20th century. And you have to imagine this before the time of the internet, the kind of work it took to organize across many cities in the US and to simultaneously protest. This protest brought them to the attention of the House Subcommittee on Un-American Activities. And it was not a good look for the HUAC, because they're bringing in housewives and children's book illustrators who just want to keep radiation out of their babies' teeth and their babies' bodies. And it was almost laughed out. Like the newspapers covered this as a farce. And in fact, the women themselves investigated their investigators and found that many of them voted against peace treaties and things like that. So it was part of the downfall of the popularity of the HUAC. We know that comes later on, but people were just appalled at these women, mothers, young women being brought to this trial simply for their work against nuclear radiation. And the outcome of this is the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's got an even longer name, which was signed by President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev in 1963, literally weeks before Kennedy's assassination. It said we would not test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, so in the air, in outer space, or underwater. The only place left is underground. And scientists have estimated that this has saved anywhere between 12 to 24 million lives. Now, before researching this book, I had never even heard of Women Strike for Peace. And I think sometimes we forget about, it's easier to see the lives lost than the lives that are saved. But literally millions of people owe their lives to these brave women, the mothers who were saving baby teeth, and then the women who were marching and striking and speaking out. Okay, now we get to look at some of these women. The first I want to bring to you is Malvina Reynolds. She grew up in California. She was born to European Jewish immigrants who unfortunately caught the attention of the Klan because they supported the Scottsboro boys, teenage boys who were wrongly accused of rape. And they were actually firebombed by the KKK, and the Klan tried to kidnap them. The police came barely in time to prevent that, but that really galvanized Malvina to begin writing songs actually in her 40s, which I think is so inspiring. So she learned music, she studied with people like Pete Seeger, and she began writing her own songs and going to different protest rallies, including Women's Strike for Peace. You might know her from the song Little Boxes that has sometimes showed up in television. The show Weeds has it as its theme song. She also wrote something called the Rand Hymn. And remember, the Rand is the organization that keeps track of the doomsday clock. And she was very frustrated because she felt like they were treating people not as humans, but simply as numbers. So she wrote a pretty scathing song about that. However, the song I want to show you is What Have They Done to the Rain, which Joan Baez called like the most peaceful protest song ever written, not in its words, but in its gentleness. So let me pull up the lyrics real quick so you can see that as we're listening. Some people thought this was about acid rain or pollution, but it's actually specifically about the downwind radiation. And so you have this scene, you have a boy who's standing and there's rain coming down. He's standing in the grass disappears. There's smoke, the boy disappears. So it's very tragic in the way that it unfolds. Something that is supposed to be life-giving is actually handing out death. So let's take a little listen to that.
Just a little rain falling all around. The grass lifts its head to the heavenly sound. Just a little rain, just a little rain. What have they done to the rain?
That gives you a good taste for it. Okay. Now, one of the most famous performances of that song was by Joan Baez, who I would like to talk about next. She's still living, she's still writing songs. Her father, Albert Baez, was a brilliant scientist, and he was recruited to move to California and work on nuclear research, but he had an enormous crisis of conscience, became a Quaker, became a pacifist, and refused the prestigious position he was offered. And Joan credits his ethics and his work as a huge influence on her. In fact, her very first protest was during a drill, an atomic bomb drill, where they told the kids they would have to walk home from school the next day when they heard the alarm. She came home, looked at some math books, realized she would never make it home in time. So she just sat in her seat, and local newspapers took pictures of her and called her a communist. She was like, I did the math as a teenager. She soon came to work in the civil rights movement, working with people like Martin Luther King Jr., and singing at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. She came late to to the Women's Strike for Peace movement. She came to it in the late 1960s and 70s. But she also was the one who helped to found the first American branches of Amnesty International that continues to work towards world peace and human rights justice. As a singer and activist, she was invited to go to Hanoi in 1972 to bring Christmas packages to the American prisoners of war there. However, this travel at Christmas time was also during the time we were bombing Hanoi the hardest. And so she spent her trip basically running back and forth between the bomb shelter and her hotel. But as she was doing that, she recorded about 15 hours worth of audio, and she turned that into a collage sound album called Where Are You Now, My Son, which came out in 1973. And this is a haunting song. It's a very long song, so I'm just going to play you a couple of excerpts. But she heard a woman who was walking around her bombed out house looking for her son and then realizing that he had died. And it's a very poignant sound moment that she brings into this. This alternate is very interesting because she has such a beautiful voice, but a lot of this is poetic narration. There is a sung chorus, and there are other sounds and music from her travel itself. So I'm going to start around 2 minutes in, just give you a couple of sound samples from this album. Here we're going to hear some sounds of war, and then we're going to hear a little bit of the sung chorus. So come back here. Let's start around 2.
Oh, my son, where are you?
It's walking to the battleground that always makes me cry. I've met so few folks in my time who weren't afraid to die. But dawn bleeds with the people here, and morning skies are red, as young girls load up bicycles with flowers for the dead. An aging woman picks along the craters and the rubble, a piece of cloth, a bit of shoe, a whole lifetime of trouble. A sobbing chant comes from her throat and splits the morning air. The single son she had last night is buried under her. They say that the war is done. Where are you now, my son?
Now I want to move us forward to a recording that actually happened in the bomb shelter. And this was of various people who were huddling together at Christmas time. And you can hear a bit of Silent Night being sung, while you're also hearing some of those elements of war. So we are right about here. Stop it there. It's very poignant. It's actually hard for me to listen to because it's such a sound document of what was happening during the war, like some of the photographs that helped to shift people's perspective on what was happening during Vietnam. All right, the last woman I want to talk about today is Peggy Seeger. She is still alive. She is still singing songs. She is the half sister of Pete Seeger. She was American, but she lived in England for extended periods of time, not always by choice, because she visited China and Russia. The US took away her passport. She had to have a green card wedding to a friend, and eventually married Ewan McCall. That's a very short narration of her many adventures living in England. She now, I believe, lives back in the US. She writes about many kinds of topics, long before some of our conversations in the 2010s about women's work. She is putting that into song. She talks about childcare and equal rights. She talks about environmental impact of nuclear war, but other decisions that are made. She expressed a lot of frustration with the US basically using the UK as a nuclear storage facility, and as well as the UK itself accumulating bombs. She and her contemporaries took a very creative approach to protest, gumming up the system however they could. One of the ways is that at that time in Great Britain, as long as you had all the numbers correct, you did not have to actually write a check on a check. So one of her friends wrote their check that was to cover, basically they would protest by withdrawing their funds, they would pay their taxes except for that which was going to nuclear products, energy, bombs, and so forth. But when it got to time for their lights to be turned out, then they would like reluctantly write a check. So this woman writing the check for her nuclear energy output wrote it on the backside of a cow and sent the cow into the bank, which was not appreciated. Peggy Seeger did not do this, but she did write her check once on a rotten egg. She said it was very gingerly returned to her. And then she nicely wrote her check on the icing of a cake. But I think probably after the rotten egg, the bankers were a little afraid to eat it. So she said it disappeared, never to be seen again. She was part of the protests, the Aldermaston marches, that were part of the protest against nuclear weapons. We have a song that she wrote. So the Aldermaston marches started in 1958 and they kind of dwindled out in the late 60s, with the last one being in 1972. And she wrote this with her husband, Ewan McCall, and they use a gospel song as its setting. And I'm just going to show you the lyrics and then play you a brief clip because I want to focus in the other one. The argument is there's better things like having kids and making sure they survive into adulthood. That's a better thing to do than blowing up our world. So there's a lot of irony in this, but also it does take aim at thoughts and prayers responses. Pray for your soul, but that is not sufficient because we actually need to put our hands and feet to work against the nuclear weapons that could blow up the entire world. So I'm going to play you just a sound clip from here.
My friends, I want to warn you because I love us all. No doubt you read your papers, but the half can never be told. Politicians will try to fool you and get you to agree to blow this world to glory and end humanity. But there's better things to do than blow this world in two. You can live into your old age and your kids will be normal too.
very cheerful appeal to it, right? It sounds almost joyful or energetic. Hey, let's join together. However, the last song I want to show you, the 4-minute warning, is very different in tone. This is a map song, and it considers what would happen if an atomic bomb was dropped in the middle of London, and how long would it take to reach the other communities. So as you look at the lyrics, and I do want to take the time to play this whole thing for you, as you look at the lyrics, you're going to see a lot of place names. So imagine there's a tower in the middle of the city. And then if you were to look at London, which we're going to do, you're going to see the effects as it moves further and further out. Some people will die immediately. Some people will die in 10 years, but everyone is affected. So this is very grim. I'm sorry about this, but somebody has created a nuclear map where you can choose a size of a bomb. Historic bombs are the ones that we have in our arsenals now, and you can see what the effect would be if it were actually dropped. So this is a very large bomb. You can see if it were dropped in the middle of London, you can actually see some of the places that are mentioned in her song. She has directed that this song be sung for exactly 4 minutes, and it's important enough. Let's listen to the whole thing. It's a tough one, but this is almost the end of my talk.
Imagine a city, imagine a tower whose crown turns around fully once every hour. North, south, east, and west, see the heath and the river, with Chelsea on one side, Mile End on the other. Imagine that city, imagine that morning in summer, imagine the 4-minute warning. Panic, then wait, or kneel and start praying. 4 minutes to make your God hear what you're saying. Look toward home, no time for leave taking. The sound that you hear is 12 million hearts breaking. There's a circle around you, 6 miles to the rim. From Acton to Poplar, from Finchley to Balham, Dulwich to Hendon, it's the heart of the nation. Not a blade of grass standing, complete devastation.
I changed my mind. It's pretty heavy, and I think even 1.5 minutes gets you into the heart of the song. Carrying it forward, the first thing I want to say, remind you of those 12 to 24 million lives that were saved. Protesting, using our voices, singing about the war's impact, all of these things, they might not always have fruit at first, but they are working towards our community good. Secondly, I really appreciate how these women talked about so many dimensions of the war, from ecology to the impact on families and children, safe work practices, and so forth. It's a very nuanced view. It's more than us versus them, but it's also, what are we doing? Are we doing our part? The women I mentioned, Joan Baez and Peggy Seeger, are still singing, and they're still singing about current events and issues. Unfortunately, Malvina Reynolds has passed away, but I had a chance to talk to her daughter, Nancy Reynolds Schimmel, and she's a founding member of a group called the Acapellas, which started during the Occupy movement, and it teaches people how to use songs as part of their protest or advocacy events. So that is the end of my talk, and I will be glad, and Tim will be glad to hear questions that you have. So I'm going to stop my sharing. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was a fantastic presentation and just brought up so many questions for me. I'm sure others have questions as well. So please put your questions in the chat or use the Q&A feature and I can read them off. That last song you played for us was really intense. And
Yeah.
just the choice of not having music, of just having it be this kind of calling, very eerie feeling. Can you explain anything in addition to the choice of not having music in the background or any more details?
Absolutely. It's almost in a minor key. It's actually in a older kind of key than major and minor called a mode, but it has this very dark, foreboding feeling just in the way that the notes are used. And then also the fact that you're trying to sing it in exactly 4 minutes. It means that you're going to have to sing faster and slower at parts in order to fill the time. So there's the 4-minute warning, but there's also around 4 minutes for the spread to happen. So 4 minutes is a metaphor. And so you're sitting almost in this timeless place of dread. Like that minute and a half felt way longer than a minute and a half to me. Because you can't anticipate the next turn. It also means she has to have an incredible sense of pitch in order to keep it in the place in her voice for 4 entire minutes. It does sound very Celtic. Yes, absolutely. It sounds like a lament. And she's trying to sit you in this space where you don't turn away from what the consequences would be. I will say, oh, go ahead, him.
Oh, there's a double meaning to the phrase 4-minute warning also. Like in the song, it depicts, how fast radiation can spread, after the bomb explodes within 4 minutes. And it also refers to the 4-minute warning where England had 4 minutes, the people of England had 4 minutes to find shelter once the air raid sirens went off, where like their radar detection equipment would be able to identify, a Soviet bomber is in the air. We think it has a weapon. So we have 4 minutes before it explodes. In America, we had at least half an hour because we have the Atlantic Ocean. So imagine being in England, you have 4 minutes to find shelter. So, it was so much to comprehend, people made a joke out of it. They said, well, 4 minutes is just enough time to boil an egg. So that was the joke at the time.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that additional context. We have a question about jazz artists you may have found who wrote and performed in this genre.
Yeah, we didn't find very many jazz musicians who addressed it. I think primarily because jazz is more of an instrumental genre, although there are many great jazz singers, of course.
And some were sent as cultural ambassadors, right?
Yeah.
From Chattanooga. What's his name? Was it Dave Brubeck who went over?
Yeah.
Dave Brubeck went over as a cultural ambassador to Russia.
Yeah, we didn't find a whole lot of jazz musicians who are writing about the Cold War, like against it. So.
Right. We did have I wouldn't categorize him simply as a jazz musician, but Paul Robeson, who could basically sing any kind of music under the stars, was a huge he tied civil rights into the Cold War message. He could sing jazz, he could sing blues, he could sing opera. He was also a lawyer, and he was also had his passport removed when he helped to write a document called We Call Genocide, that was presented to the UN, where he basically exposed US's human rights violations towards African Americans to the whole world, and the FBI did not want that to happen. So, broader than the jazz question, but he was a very important figure. And when he has passport revoked, he still helped to organize through the power of phone calls. He called up Scottish miners and sang protest songs to them so they could organize their union.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have comment and then a question. Thank you for this interesting presentation. Greetings from Europe, where we are as worried as anything in the past few days. I wonder if current events will generate a new set of artistic responses.
It's an interesting question. I was teaching a class on this when Russia invaded Ukraine. And there was a small wave of either new songs or songs that were pulled back out. I believe, was it YouTube did a video connecting, I can't remember the song, basically connecting the past to the present in that moment.
Yeah, we're not finding a whole lot of songs. Like a lot of songs are written about current events, dealing with the Cold War, but they don't rise to the top. Like during the Vietnam era, there were like, so there's this dozens and dozens of songs that were hit songs, about the Vietnam War or even the Korean War. And even in the 1980s, song artists like Sting and Billy Joel in the song 99 Red Balloons by the German group Nina, there were a lot of hit songs that addressed, different aspects of the Cold War. But, since, the 2000s, we found lots of songs. But with the splintering of genres and the rise of, MP3s and streaming and just the different way that music is distributed and listened to these days, I guess those type of songs don't seem quite as relevant and don't become hits anymore. So
Well, what I would say, like looking at it from the folk side, is a lot of times there's recycling or recontextualizing of older songs and applying them to new situations. I mean, because so many of the issues are they're still carrying on, whether you're talking about, you know, employment rights or women's rights or civil rights. There's, if you look back at just this rich body of literature, we see these recycling, we even see this turn back, I would say, in movies like the recent one on Bob Dylan, where we're turning back and almost in nostalgia, but looking back at what has already been said and like trying to apply it to our current situations. There's also, on top of the issues that Tim mentioned, we also are in a much more litigious situation where, unless you give specific permission for sharing your songs, you can't just really take it into a rally and sing it in the same way that the folk songs were explicitly made to do. And of course, we have some people like Tom Lehrer, who just donated all of his songs to the public domain, and he was the only one to give us free use of his songs in the book. So we have an envelope with Tom Lehrer's signature on it, which is we've saved because it was a really neat part of the process. So that there is that copyright issue, I think, is part of the maybe wariness around newer songs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. We have a question about reactions of students in your class when they're learning about this music. How do they typically react?
Well, one said that he was going to continue research on the impacts of nuclear war. He said, I'd never heard any of these things. These were never taught in my class, a lot of these issues. We've talked about some of the proxy wars and some of the things that the US itself did in South America with installing, you know, dictators at some points in order to achieve our own interests in the Cold War. It wasn't an easy conversation to have. Most of them took it very seriously. Some of them were deeply saddened, you know, because they had this, you know, short time when we weren't in a war. And I think for some reason it really hit close for a lot of them. And so we talked about, and I think it's conversations we need to continue to have, like how do you take care of yourself in a time when we're impacted by so much grim news? Like, so we did have that side of the conversation as well. They were all interested and engaged, and some of them felt challenged, and some of them just did incredible projects, investigating either continuing issues from then or looking at what people like. We had a great Dolly Parton project, for example, where she was looking at, you know, how does she address different issues? And a lot of times she does it not through song, although she does that sometimes, but through the work and the money that is generated through the songs. She sees the issues and she does something about it, which I very much respect.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Of course.
At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how the viewpoints were divided by genre. I'm just curious in what way, and is that because the genres of that time were pretty constrained? You couldn't play with, like, country was very country, folk was folk, and it seems like in modern day you can kind of play with music genre a lot more. But is that the case, or why was
Yeah.
it divided?
I'll take the last part, like when the Chicks, formerly known as the Dixie Chicks, took a stand against our war in the Middle East. They were estranged from country music. So there's still these kind of guiding lines. You don't cross this way or this way within a genre. Tim, do you want to say something about the history of the genres?
Yeah, like the two genres that wrote the most Cold War songs in the earliest period, from like 1945, you know, into the 60s, were country and folk. And these two are like polar opposites. Like the
Even if
country,
they sounded similar.
yeah, the country musicians were all patriotic, and they were looking at the Cold War as simply an extension of World War II. You know, we beat the Germans, now we can just beat the Soviets. We can just outproduce them with nuclear weapons, and everything will be great. And if we have to bomb people, well, that's okay because God's on our side. So, but the folk musicians, they were always speaking out against nuclear testing, nuclear weapons. They did not trust the government. They did not trust the Soviets. So they thought it was very much a bad thing. So,
But they
and
were
then,
coming out of it as veterans as well.
yeah,
I just want to say both of them are coming out of their World War II experience with different perspectives.
so you did have these patriotic songs, you know, in the 40s and 50s. But by the time of the Korean War and especially the Vietnam War, the patriotic songs start to fade away when the general populace realizes, you know, how dangerous these weapons are. And if a world war starts, it's going to affect the whole planet. So, that type of patriotism, we're gonna win. We could win a nuclear war, fades away, and people realize it's all bad. So
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to read one of the comments in the chat. It says, many labor unions are still singing folk songs.
Absolutely.
Seattle Labor Chorus is out on the streets singing zipper songs, updating songs with new words. I think Emma's Revolution is another one of the groups out there singing new songs. And there's lots of songs, titles, and artists that were in the chat, put in the chat by people. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your book and research and all of the women songwriters with us. It was just wonderful.
Of course. Let me pull up my very last slide in case anybody wants.
Oh, yeah.
I have a QR code with a link to our book, as well as a link to free Spotify playlists of songs from each chapter.
Yeah,
Thank you all for attending and for your conversation and for finding more songs. It's every time we talk to people, we find there's even more.